Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, Scott. How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I'm really well, thanks. I'm really well. It's so wonderful to have you on. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been really been looking forward to this conversation. I found your page. Would have been a few years ago now, and yeah, it's really calling to me. It's such a fascinating kind of world that you're working in, and I'm so keen to chat about what that's like for you, and yeah, all the juicy questions.
Yeah, awesome.
First, why don't we introduce our audience to you and who you are, what you do? You're obviously the owner and founder of SkyCave Retreats.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how that whole project came to be.
Sure. So we're in Southern Oregon, and we have currently three dark retreat caves where people go into total darkness, usually for 3 days. Typically, to paint a picture of what a typical retreat here looks like, is typically people arrive and they have 24 hours to settle in, to weave in and out of the darkness. And then there's a session, a somatic based session with my other teammate, Adrian, that deeply prepares people for the dark. And it also really distills down what we've learned over the years of being here with hundreds of dark retreatants. And we can get into some of that, of what is that and what does that entail. And so that really prepares people for a more embodied experience in the dark. And then they go in, which would then be their second night, as they've been here for about 24 hours. Then typically it's 3 days, 4 nights in the dark. And then they emerge in the morning and they have another 24 hours to integrate and another session with Adrian. That really, on that end, it both helps people just deepen into what they came to directly know and also digest what they weren't able to really settle with, as the
Mm.
darkness is an amazing vehicle for exposing, for seeing, but that doesn't necessarily equal the ability to digest, to be with, and include. And so the darkness is primarily an exposing mechanism.
Mm.
And then when somebody genuinely settles, it can also be this digestive, integrative mechanism as well, where people begin to include more of themselves. And so it's very different than plant medicine. It just has really not many correlations at all.
Hmm.
Uh, it is not about a peak experience. It is not a blast off to mm, some altered state of reality, although it does alter you in the dark, but it's not a blast off. It's not about a peak experience. You don't get filled with these spiritual experiences that make you feel self-important.
So it's not an add-on per
It's
se,
not an
right?
addition. There you go.
Yeah.
It's not an addition, it's a subtraction. And,
Interesting.
and that's very different as we have people who come from all different orientations, people who come from maybe more of a spiritual orientation, a plant medicine orientation. There tends to be this movement of addition
Hmm.
to have a spiritual experience, to attain new knowledge, enlightenment, some kind of sense of doing the work and progressing and achieving and transforming, and all of these things it's similar to the way that we orient our Western mind orients, slapped on with a spiritual lens.
Hmm.
And in the darkness, we tend to actually see that movement tends to come from a contraction. Underneath it tends to be a resistance to where we're really at.
Hmm.
There's this movement to want more, and not that there's anything inherently wrong with that. It
Hmm.
is a natural kind of movement, and especially natural in our culture. So nothing wrong with it. And from what we see, we tend to be pretty disconnected from where that impulse arises from.
The not enough, right?
Not
Like,
There's a discontent. There's
right.
not enough, and then we cover it in more, in all these different things. It's like consuming experiences. It's another form of consumerism. And again, not that there's anything wrong with that. We're on this planet to experience life
Right.
on one level. And what's driving that? There's just this exploration of like, Why do I want that? Why do I feel like I need that? Not that there's anything wrong with it, but where's that coming from in me? And the darkness is this more of an exploration of subtraction. What happens when we take that all away? What happens when you're not having a cool experience? What happens when you're not having an experience? And what some people find is that simplicity feels threatening.
Ah,
Because if everything's just simple, then there's not this sense of self-importance. There's not a purpose. You're not even doing the work and getting somewhere really good and making something happening. It's just simple. But the reality is the dark is just simple. Now things happen and there is a process and something's moving, and the dark's not just dark. It feels alive and people experience it with a texture, and it is a substance, and nothing's happening on some level. And so that level of simplicity, it feels threatening. For some people, it's like the greatest relief they've ever experienced. So it's different for everyone. We've
right.
had close to 500 people come through here, and there are very different types of the way that people are structured and organized, and so they react and they respond to the darkness differently.
Hmm.
Now, one thing, I went on a big tangent from explaining the dark, but I'll circle back and can share more of like how I got into it. But while we're on this thread, one thing that the offering has evolved over the years. Like where we were 4.5 years ago is really different than where we're at now. A lot of that has to do with Adrian, who's my other teammate who joined me 2.5 years ago. I've known Adrian for over 15 years, and she came on and joined me in this. And she brought a lot more of a very grounded, feminine approach. I historically came more from a very linear, spiritual oriented, achieving spirituality kind of approach. And maybe that's a segue into before I did my first dark retreat in 2012. Over the course of 10 years, I had spent about 2.5 years in solitude in the mountains, mostly in southern Baja, also in Mount Shasta in California. I'd spend 4 to 6 months alone in the mountains, meditating, fasting, singing, dancing, just really living a wild, slightly aesthetic at times. Didn't feel that way, but an aesthetic, extreme life.
Yeah.
And somebody mentioned a darkness retreat to me in 2011, 2012. And I was like, that's right up my alley. I love the exploration of solitude. And so my wife and I in 2012, we blacked out our house and we went in the dark together for 5 days. And it's very different doing it at home. It's very different doing it with somebody. And so I was like, I want to go do it alone. So I went back down to Baja and I finished building this earth bag dome that somebody had started down there. And 4 or 5 weeks later, I went in there. I was way more extreme in my earlier days. It was a 8, 9 foot diameter dome, really small. I went in there for 10 days.
Oh,
I just had a waste bucket, my water, a bedroll. I didn't have anyone to support me really, so I brought in all my food, and I figured when I'd run out of food, I'd just keep staying. So I ate for 5 days. I fasted for 5 days. We definitely don't let people do that now. I've learned a lot since then. And a lot of that was just a byproduct of my own conditioning, the only ways that I coped and escaped. And
mhm.
that was masking whatever. And there was a lot of sincerity woven into it. And I was deeply humbled in that time in the dark because I was familiar with solitude. I could meditate for 12, 14 hours a day and hardly move from my space. And I could spend weeks and weeks in solitude and be very happy. And I found the darkness to be really challenging. And so for me, there was like, I was like, I personally couldn't have felt more qualified to go into the dark.
Right.
And I was deeply humbled and was like, I'm missing something. Like, and it's almost like I remember I could feel that doing practice, meditation, felt unnatural. At the time, I didn't really have the language, nor did I really have the support for someone to help me point so I could see. But in hindsight, and what I reflect on what I was feeling, was there was this sense of, it felt unnatural because there was this efforting, there was this striving and achieving of getting somewhere, which is ultimately a contraction to cover something that I'm not comfortable or maybe not even have the capacity at that time to feel. I
Right.
didn't have that whole foresight at the time or vision of seeing that clearly, but I could feel like this feels unnatural. If I can't meditate, then what do I do?
Oh,
And
yeah,
that
it's the
thread
need
of,
to do something, right?
yeah, and that thread of sincerity carried me. And it was like, I want to do more of this. There's something here. I was aware of, I'm a lot more sensitive. I can feel more without doing anything. Like it was almost like I don't need to meditate, but I'm still conflicted. And so that kind of birthed the movement in me. Like, I want to build a dark retreat. I think maybe a few of my friends might be interested. And so there was this impulse to make something happen. It was 5 years later, we landed on this land in Southern Oregon. Within a year, we built our first dark retreat. We built the first one out of mud, sand, and straw called Cobb. And it took a year to build. And then I thought we'd use it right away, but the walls are 18 inches thick of mud. And so it takes a long time for it to dry. And
Right.
so we built it in 20, we started in 2018. We started using it in the spring of 2020. It was a great COVID kind of business adventure because people were just alone. So it didn't really,
Impact you, yeah.
yeah. And then we began, and it really just snowballed from there. The interest now, initially, as we kind of look at the whole arc of our offering and how we were with people, is initially it was like what I knew was just like people they went in, they did their own thing. There wasn't many check-ins. There was like dropped off the food. People came out of the dark on their own. And that kind of went on. And then, and then it carried on like that for a while. And then Adrian came on about I guess a year and a half into it, and maybe 2 years into it. And as she started to interface, she's brings the somatic aspect to it for a somatic practitioner. Adrian also has a lot of depth and is incredibly perceptive, and so can really feel what's happening in someone, even if they're not aware of it, and then can really ask the questions and orient someone to where they then are able to know the truth of that themselves.
Interesting.
So in the beginning, I would share this person just came out of the dark. They had an amazing experience. And when, as she started to come on, some things shifted. We started to have a few influencers come, and people started to ask to be brought out or to be filmed. And so then I started to bring people out. I also started to realize that a lot of the content out there about Dark Retreat was pretty misleading. It
Mm.
was just like people sensationalizing spirituality and then that getting overlaid on the dark retreat. It's not a
Mhm.
sensational experience at all, not in the level of plant medicine
Yeah.
sensational. It's in your body sensational, but it's simple and intimate.
Yeah.
It's more feminine than this like masculine, like conquering, achieving the most greatness, spiritual warrior kind of blast off thing.
Right.
And so as I started bringing people out and they'd have the session with Adrienne, I'd be like, this person had an amazing experience, all this. And then she'd have the session with them and she would just share minimally, but would share that's not what was going on. Like they had a lot of undigested stuff. They were highly anxious. That was really challenging. And I was like, whoa, I'm completely missing what's happening. But as then I looked at it more deeply, it's what people were sharing, but because they weren't able to actually be with what was really happening. And so there was this covering. And also, when someone is having a more traumatizing experience in the dark, they're really conflicted, but they're staying in there. When they come out, it's like being lost in the desert for 5 days. You're really happy. You feel a lot of relief, emotion
Right.
moves, everything's beautiful. So the exit looks like, whoa, that was really profound and powerful. And especially in the early days when I didn't have much conversation while people were in there and I was just witnessing when they were coming out, it was like, that was amazing. I wasn't realizing that a lot of that was because of relief.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
And so now that doesn't happen that much. Every once in a while, well, now I'm tracking with people. Adrienne and I are in conversation. She has the sessions before and after. I'm up there with people in the morning and the evening. We talk through the wall. And so there's a check-in. Sometimes it lasts 10 minutes and sometimes it could be an hour. It's whatever's appropriate. It's really just a point of contact and connection where people then, through just the connection of just, there's almost the permission to just be here in the simplicity and just to relax. And then from that, they're able to connect in their own body. There is a sense of safety and permission to feel what's there.
Mhm.
And so every once in a while, there is someone who's not really able to settle. They can co-regulate during the check-ins, but then they go back into what they're in. And when they come out, there is this sense of relief. And it just has a very different timbre than somebody coming out, and it may look the same, but it's not relief. It's like it just has a different feel.
Right. I wonder what that would look like to interview, because I've seen the post like come out of the session, they take the goggles off and it's wow, it does seem so transformational. I'm sure it is on its own level, but like you say, I never thought about it being the essence of relief. What would that look like 10 days down the out of the session, right?
Yeah, this thing. So I'd say most of now the people who are coming out, it's not the relief. It is this different quality. In the earlier days, maybe some of it, and maybe even before we were filming, there was more of that. And it's harder to, from an outside perspective, it's harder to see. I didn't see it in my early days until Adrienne started pointing me towards noticing it more. Because in a lot of cases, it's covered. Like people almost don't even notice it themselves. And this happens a lot in the check-ins. Somebody could be like, an extreme case is somebody who's on the verge of a panic attack. And I could go up and it's like, how are you feeling? They could be like, it's good. I'm doing my best to be okay with everything. And then it quickly jumps to like, it's fine and it's good. And I'm like, wait, if you're doing your best to be okay with everything, what is it in your body that you're doing your best to be okay with? And then all of a sudden it's like, I'm like heat flashes and there's like levels of panic happening, but it was just kept contained. That's an extreme example. Other ones are like people being like, it's all good. You just allow everything and like all these things. But after being with hundreds of people now, there is a kind of quality of connection, simplicity, softness, settledness that happens when somebody really drops into the dark. It's not necessarily great. So it's really settled and simple. There can still be some greatness, but it's not like an excited great.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's the draw for me is you really are, I completely associate my value with my productivity. So for me to actually drop into the root of that and to be with that, I have to eliminate all the distractions that allow me to just follow that synapses that I do. Oh, okay, that trigger comes up. I have a moment of stillness. It's time to do something. So that's what calls me to it. So I think for the most part, people expect to be uncomfortable. I don't think people are going in going, this is going to be this. Yeah, yeah.
No, it matters what's moving them, where they're coming from, what they read about it, who's influencing them, all those things. I'd say there are a large percentage of people who don't come with that. There is a contingent of people who do come. Now there is a large amount of people who say, I have no expectations. Everyone has an expectation. No one expects to be sad. No one expects to be, some people, but not many people expect to be go in there and be sad. Almost no one, there's a small amount of people, but most people don't expect to go in and be afraid. I would say 100% of people have a fear response in there. And if we had this conversation a year ago, I would have said, yeah, 10, 20% of people experience fear. But that was also another thing that I wasn't seeing clearly. And so there's lots now that I still don't see clearly and know, but know it when you know it. And that was something that it was covered really well, or we weren't really identifying that this is actually a stress fear response. And so I'll go into that, but to digress for a moment, because you asked about when people are just coming out and it's just the relief, is that it's much more than just going into the darkness and like having experienced qualified support is really the types of experiences people have here or have in general in the dark is because of the support.
Right.
Otherwise, 95% of people who go in will likely go into some kind of stress, fear response, and then go into some kind of managing coping mechanism and not really even know that. And that could even look like stillness and relaxation, but it's some form of dissociation or numbness. It's an extreme version. And then others just could get by and they manage it. And so having support and the experience of somebody who's tracked with many people or are able to track somatically with people and really return people to their body and a real simple honesty of what's going on is really important. And now, as we've tracked and mapped out some of the
Parallels.
stress and fear responses, the parallels and the stress fear responses, which is a parallel through it all, we're able to orient people more to it. And so now it's not expect to be scared, but like it will happen on some level to some varying degree. And so what happens is just at a very basic animalistic level is the part of you that's tasked with survival. To like right now, if something there was a sound behind us or something whizzed in our periphery, we would turn to look. Like we are just wired to protect ourselves and scan the environment for threats unconsciously. It's just happening. And then you go in the dark, and that part of you that's tasked with that can't do its job. It can't see and it can't hear. Every once in a while, there's maybe a muffled sound, but there's no real sounds. There's no sight. You can't, like, on that at base level, you cannot assure yourself that you're safe, cognitively safe. But like the animal body, it just doesn't know. How can it be sure that it's safe?
So does
And
that heighten that response then because it panics that it doesn't have that sensory experience? And then so you're
definitely,
experiencing that
yeah, it feels
response?
threatened. Yeah, it feels threatened. Initially, the
Yeah.
darkness is a stressor. It creates some kind of level of threat. Now, that doesn't have to continue. For some people, it does. I think without people having proper support in the dark, it carries through, not for everyone, but for most people, it would carry through. And then for most of them, they wouldn't even notice it because we're so evolved with managing with all our different mechanisms to get by. We're built to survive. So people just get by in there. Imagine somebody in the lost in the desert for 4 days. They're going to get by. At times, they're going to have insights of how beautiful their life is and how much they love and they appreciate. Just when somebody's sick, they're just like, my life is beauty. Just all these. So there are insights and there's appreciations. And when it's done, it was like, that was amazing. Do you want to go do
Contrast,
it
right?
again? Definitely not. But that was, so there's still, and then it gets thrown through our different lenses. And so it gets puffed up even more. And then we remember the insights. But with the support and that connection of the check-ins, someone's able to really orient a
And
bit
give you a
more.
full view. Because I think you have only one lens when you go in there. And it's so powerful to have a facilitator or a leader that can be like, oh, okay, did you look at it from this angle? And are you seeing it from a full 360 view? So that's potent.
Yeah. And so what happens then is people feel to some degree at some point there is this fear response. And that could be as extreme as somebody having a panic attack to just somebody like genuinely unsettled. And then from that, depending on people's mechanisms, somebody who's more oriented spiritually, they may orient towards doing breath work and just, but then ultimately it's not really a movement to connect and be curious. It's a movement to cover and change and fix. It's not seen as that way. And a lot of times it works, so it covers it, but then but then they keep doing it. I fall into this category historically too, so I know it intimately very well, but it's ultimately a cover. And
Right.
without having maybe someone else asking questions, you may not even come to see that. And
Yeah.
so typically then there is this threat response. And for most people, it's like a flutteriness or a pressure in the chest or a pressure in the belly. But some people won't even know. They'll just know that they're anxious and they're doing all these different things. But once I'm up there and it's like, how are you feeling? And they might be like, it's great, it's good, I'm peaceful, I'm calm, I'm loving it. But like reading between the lines and knowing the feeling of when it's actually like that is, so what does that feel like in your body? And once somebody attunes to their body, like, actually, there's a little pressure in my chest. And then what does that feel like? They're like, I feel a little uneasy. And then all of a sudden it's like,
Aha. They don't even recognize the feeling or the
they
somatic.
don't even recognize it. A percent there is, like you said, there's parallels. There's people who don't recognize it. The people who are like recognizing it, but they're like, but I've got it. I'm doing these things and it's fine. And then there's the other people who are like, I'm not okay. I need help. And on some level, everyone ultimately who really sinks in lands in, I need help. And then because then it's like there's the collapse. There's the letting go of trying to manage it when you really land in, I need help.
Mm.
And this is one reason of many why typically men have a harder time in the dark.
Oh, interesting.
It's a lot, which was totally mind bending for me initially. Because when I set out on this, it was like, this is for people who have spent a lot of time in solitude and have a lot of meditation, and none of that really matters at all. It actually, more often than not, is a hindrance.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
And men typically in our culture have a harder time acknowledging that they're scared
Mhm.
and that they're sad and that they need help
Mhm.
or these things. And so that makes it difficult. And then that kind of typical masculine movement of conquering, controlling, achieving, progressing.
Right.
There's none of that in the dark. And so that adds another layer of,
Challenging your identity.
yeah, challenging your identity. And then when someone really drops in the dark and it looks so different for everyone, and it has this quality of connectivity, nurture, gentleness, spaciousness, softness, tenderness, all these feminine qualities
Right.
that are more natural to a woman, especially like if she feels safe,
Mhm.
then that level of vulnerability and tenderness comes online. And what we've noticed is that's also natural to men, to anyone when they generally feel safe. There just tends to be a little bit more barriers for men to really fall into that.
That makes
And
sense.
so when someone genuinely, so one thing that happens when people feel that stress, fear, threat response is they go into their mind and there's this sense of I'm in a room, the door's locked, there's a lock on the other side so people can lock themselves in there. And so they know that no one can come in, just an added safety. So like I'm in the room, no one can come in. I was in here for the last 24 hours. I know that I'm safe. I'm fine. And then they go through. But that is a movement away from, it's almost like a dissociative movement. Although it's linear and logical,
Mhm.
it almost ignore that doesn't actually take away the threat response. It covers it and pushes it down. And so we really encourage people to come in contact with that. Like, what would happen if it was okay to be afraid? What if it was okay to be afraid? And usually it's just not okay to be afraid. Because if you're okay being afraid, you're then that much more vulnerable to a threat because you're not protected. You're not mad, you're not on guard and like doing something about it.
Mhm.
And so when somebody genuinely drops in, that tends to be with the support initially, but some people just have that resource of on their own where they're okay with being genuinely in their body, not like I'm okay being afraid because I can just destroy anything. It's more of a I'm okay relaxing and just opening while I'm afraid and not knowing this sense of time when it's going to pass. It tends to, within a second or two, it changes. Like when somebody genuinely allows the fear there, within a second, they're relaxed. And now, as opposed to being fear, it's pressure in the chest, really different than fear. And now they're relaxed and they're like, oh, there's this pressure in my chest and I'm relaxed. And it's what would happen if we just leaned into just the relaxation? And one of the invitations here is if somebody's laying on the floor, sitting in the chair, is like to feel that part of their back or their butt that meets the floor or the chair or the bed. And what does it feel like to feel supported by the floor, to just fall into the chair and the floor and feel supported? And in that, because that's always available, we're always resting on something. And so when somebody really leans into that, there's this sense of I'm supported and relaxed, and I feel pressure in my chest, but that's okay because I also feel supported. And then sometimes very quickly, and other times not, that pressure then maybe eases because a lot of that pressure is unconscious resistance,
Yeah, to the emotion.
protecting and managing and controlling and all those things. And then when somebody really relaxes and opens in that way, they still may experience waves of sadness and grief and fear and anxiety and shame and all the things. And there's something else present. And then there's these movements into deeper levels of intimacy in the body, tenderness, delicateness, grief, sadness, the tenderness in sadness, and all of these movements. And so it is more of this exposing experience, which then can invite us into a deeper intimacy with what's
Right.
really here.
And I would imagine that people leave with greater regulation tools. And you would hope a deeper sense of awareness, because when you remove all the sensory pieces and when you learn to witness the mind wanting to control the scenario or the feeling, or which we know doesn't work,
Mm-hmm.
but imagine participants are leaving with a way greater sense of themselves and some tools for regulating when those responses come up. I know just from my experience with my work that people really lack self-awareness in their body. Just like, how are you embodying this feeling? Were you aware that this emotion has a sensation in your body? So that alone is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that happens definitely where people, there is for anyone, no matter what, even if like people experience that level of just relief when they came out and there's a lot of coping and managing, there is still, they saw something they didn't see in themselves. On any level, it is exposing. Now, for a lot of people, it's hard to really be fully honest with it because our system might not genuinely be able to be with it. And that's where the support and somebody who's able to ask the questions and be that co-regulation so somebody then can drop in and be with that. And it's amazing to see it's completely flipped my ideas of spirituality, definitely, especially coming from historically where I came from. Whereas in the early days, I remember the first person who came here and she was like, I don't meditate. I don't really like to meditate. And I was like, wow, we'll see how this goes. This was in the earlier days. And she had an amazing experience, really dropped in. And I was like, wow, that was interesting. And then as it went on and witnessing more people, there was some guy, he really stood out to me. He came last year. He was like, I don't meditate. I don't even like to meditate. The idea of controlling my mind, I'm not into, didn't no spiritual aspirations or orientation. And he went into the dark and within, and he had this genuine movement of honesty, authenticity, not trying to be or achieve something else, just being with. And he was able to be receptive and be vulnerable. And within the first day was really challenging for him because the level of exposure, and he was just let it all be there. And by the second day, he was just like in tears of how beautiful it is within him and the level of stillness. He was just mind still for hours. And I was like, some people meditate their entire lives, 20, 30 years, and don't have hours of stillness. And he was just like, I'm not even meditating. And noticing that again and again, not for everyone, but for some people, and not that's the goal, that just happens for some people as they settle in their body. But for me, just noticing that was like, yeah, it really changed a lot Because then there'll be people like myself. When I first went in, I certainly didn't. I was witnessing people drop in far deeper than I ever did in so many of my early dark retreats. And I had so much meditation experience, but it doesn't actually matter because a lot of that is just another form of control. It doesn't
Okay.
have to be, and it's not
Yeah.
always, but it can be. And so witnessing people who had little to no meditation experience and drop in so deep and with so much stillness has really changed a lot for me. And it's also changed where I think for me, there was definitely this idea that the more spiritually evolved someone is, the less sadness they experience, the less fear they experience.
Right.
There are these
Right.
masculine overlays or cultural overlays. And so those have really gotten digested, as I can see that would maybe because somebody's able to control themselves more, but in a genuinely open, vulnerable, receptive state. It's less about what's happening and more about that quality of connection to what's happening.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's not what I expected. And so glad that we got a chance to chat about this because I'm registered for your waitlist. And I'm like, wow, I didn't really anticipate that was I come from like you say, this I don't meditate well, but I come from a spiritual background. I play in plant medicine and it is I knew it was going to be a different experience in that regard, but interesting how you put it that it's a subtraction versus an addition. You're not going in to expand your consciousness. And I think to some degree there are
It happens.
that happens, but just going deeper within and being able to surrender to the pieces of ourselves that we struggle with and that we mask and we cope with our spiritual practices. And like you say, there's no right and wrong. There's just simply tools that are really effective for some things and not really effective for others. So I'm
Yeah.
so intrigued by that.
And
So
when we shed as we're able to shed, yeah, there is no right or wrong. And we have those mechanisms because we may not be able to actually genuinely be with what's underneath it. So it's not like those mechanisms are actually at some point were beneficial and essential to survival. So it's not let's just get rid of them
yeah,
because then that would be another kind of mechanism. Oh, I'm not supposed to do that. It's supposed to
right.
be like this. And so there is just this, that's where it's more, we're like, so you're doing that, that's fine. And I'd be more like, maybe before you have that, or right before you act on that impulse, just notice what's happening in your body. And then all of a sudden, there's more awareness of, oh, I'm feeling trapped, or there's pressure here, and now I want to go do this, but I didn't know that. And just that noticing begins to shift things on its own. Not don't go do that, but maybe just notice what's happening first before you lean into that. And that can really change things. And like you said, there is a sense of expansion. The darkness is infinite and vast. And it's like it happens from the inside out. There's a Nisargadatta, who's a master. He used to say it was something like, instead of searching for what you don't have, uncover what it is that you've never lost. And so it's less about replicating, manufacturing, producing spiritual states or experiences.
Right.
And as we drop into just like, where am I? I'm right here. What's it like to be right here? And then all of a sudden, that is the person who's never had stillness is just hours in stillness and they're expanded to the far reaches of the universe, but they're not doing it or trying to do that. They're just like, they're just being natural. And then from that, and that's been a thing that's really is as people are able to just relax in that naturalness, there's so much that then arises, but there's not a reaching for
Right.
this other thing.
And it's like you're in that state of surrender. In losing our resistance, we allow other things to be seen and to come in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
There's that school of thought that abundance is always around us. And it's our resistance to our constructs, our social paradigms that prevent that from coming in. So when you can drop into that still state, it's amazing what will come in and what will become a remembering of sorts, right?
Totally. Yeah. And that's just that happens on its own. Like we don't even like some people are like, my mind's just going and it's just, what if that was okay? Because there's this sense that it's not okay. There's an expectation that my mind's supposed to be still. So there's all these sneaky expectations that we don't even know that we have that keeps us. It's like a lot of people say, whoa, I didn't know that I needed permission to feel this way.
Mm.
And like that, like I didn't, my mind's wild and that's wrong. But not even realizing that was just another somebody
Paradigm.
else's idea, another cultural thing, this way that we are trying to strive and achieve. And it's uncomfortable. So, yes, I don't want my mind to be that way. And it's uncomfortable because there's something in my body I don't want to feel, but I'm not realizing that. And then so all of a sudden it's like, oh, and one question I'll ask people at times when they're in there and there's something up is like, what if it was okay to feel this way? And not even to overlay my truth, like it's okay, but it's just like for them, tell me what happens in your body if it was okay to feel this way. And then all of a sudden, there's like the shoulders come down, people's jaws relax, their fists. Oh, it's like they notice in their own directly that there was resistance. And
Mhm.
if it was okay to feel this way, there would be a part of me that relaxes. And that really begins to change a
Right.
lot.
And not perceiving those emotions as a threat. I think that's the most difficult part, is that we put a label on those specific emotions. And when you're like, wait a minute, like, why
Mhm.
am I threatened by this simple somatic experience in my body? And nobody talks about that. Nobody
Mhm.
talks about what is it that society shies away from somebody who's crying? Why does that make people uncomfortable? Why does fear or rage or anger or sorrow or grief create an uncomfortable feeling for people? It is simply just an energetic movement through the body. And so, what a beautiful gift to help people experience the surrender of, this isn't, it doesn't have to have a label. It's not a good or a bad thing. And when
Sure.
you let it be neutral, there is that beautiful place of stillness where you can just be with it.
Mhm. Yeah. And then not even that, and not even necessarily telling people like this is neutral or it's got to be neutral. It's like it is overwhelming. Like
Yeah.
it is scary. It does feel like a threat. And it's like when someone can notice the resistance that they actually feel threatened by, it's so compounded that like somebody's just doing something, they're doing their practices, they're taking a bath, they're working out, they're in their mind imagining how beautiful their life is, like they don't even realize it's, yes, it, like what do you feel in your body, and then they notice the resistance and then they notice this feels like a threat, and what if it's, yeah, what if it was okay to feel threatened, and then for some people it's not, some people are like, no, it's not okay to feel this way, and that's fine, then why don't you come out of the dark. And so that's another thing to talk about is what we've noticed over the years, and it was a while until we've noticed this, is that most people might as well be locked in there because the level of shame that people are in around leaving, to them, that door is like padlocked. Like they cannot open it. It wouldn't even open if they could, and they wouldn't even try because the level of shame people locked in the dark, locked into a lot of things, but like specifically here, the majority of people, like most people, won't leave the dark, even if they're overwhelmed, totally dysregulated. And this is where it can get dangerous if somebody doesn't have proper support or kind of like preparation, not preparation like they've prepared, but preparation right before they go in to share about these things, orientation, because that shame will keep people in. And whereas they may, even in a, when they co-regulate, they might become aware, whoa, I'm feeling these emotions, but it does feel threatening. I didn't realize that. Now I see that I was feeling threatened and I was doing this, but I'm still not okay. It's too much. I don't have the capacity to regulate and be with this. And that's fine. The question a lot of times is, what would nurture do? This isn't something to white knuckle. This isn't a hero's journey. Plenty of people could spend 3 to 4 days in the dark, but that doesn't mean anything. Lots of people could be lost in the desert for 5 days, and that's not, this isn't an endurance contest. And so,
Right.
what would nurture do? Would nurture come out? Would nurture turn the light on, light a candle? And so, on the front end, what we do our best now is to strip the shame away from coming out. And with a lot of people, we actually encourage them to come out. to turn on the light, to light a candle. And now more often than not, there's been lots of people who have come when we started to do this, where I was like, they're going to be fine. I don't even need to share this thing. And then it was like, whoa, they needed that permission to come out.
Mm.
And so not even noticing, that person's strong, they're going to be able to do it. They have the tools. And then it's just, and what we've noticed is for a handful of people, when we really strip the shame away and we're like, look, a lot of people come out for 30 seconds. They turn on the light once for 10 seconds. Once people are like, oh, that's okay, I can come out. Sometimes that's enough that somebody genuinely relaxes, because now somebody feels this stress flight response in their body and they can't even come out. So then it's, but if they know they can come out and they feel that, it's almost like a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they had the choice before, but shame took the choice away. And so we really try to bring that in. And for some people, turning on the light once, coming out, turning it on 5 times, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that somebody is orienting in a way that has them genuinely feeling safe and relaxed in their body.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who come who feel really overwhelmed. They don't have the numbing mechanisms and protective coping mechanisms that other people would have. And they feel really overwhelmed in the dark. Some of them in the earlier days may have endured, but now we're like, hey, you could come out. You could turn the light on. And we've had people recently, there was someone here and she had a big response to being in the dark, but she was like, I'm not leaving here. And I was like, I'll leave the dark, but I'm like, I'm going to stick this out. And so we really worked with her and she made it her own. She came out a few times a day. She would light a candle a lot. And she was overwhelmed initially. She couldn't spend more than like an hour in the dark without going into panic.
Mm.
And as we were with her and as she wove in the dark and made it her own, by the last day, her last full day, when I went up to check in with her, she was like, I love being in my body. I love being in the dark. And she spent the whole full day in the dark, genuinely connected, relaxed. And it was like, that was way more important and potent for her than spending 3 or 4 days in the dark. So it's not necessarily about
Oh,
3 or 4 days consecutively in the dark's going to do it. The dark's going to expose, but if you're not genuinely with, then you're just enduring and coping, and that's not going to do anything ultimately, unless you're here to advance your coping skills. But that's just not like what we're really being with here. And so there is that, which we're really like, it's not about staying consecutively in the dark. It's more about honoring your own capacity. And we're here supporting that with you and really allowing it to be a very personal, unique, direct experience for each person.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, I hadn't even considered that. And what a great piece to, I guess it's going to be cool to see just how your program evolves and all of the parallels that you start to understand and how to support people through their journey. And I think like you've already demonstrated the evolution of your program has been pretty profound already in the last few years. So that's fantastic. Wow. So what are the biggest issues? There's a couple things that even just pondering what my experience will be like is people's perception of time one of the paradigms that they struggle with. Is there, did any of your guests notice an elevation in their sensory experiences? So when they leave, do they have a heightened sense of smell or taste, or does it elevate your other senses at all?
Yeah, on a visual sense, people have a varied experience of visuals in the dark. I think prior to us starting to film people, there was a lot of, I think, from the spiritual sensational kind of movement, there was a lot around like sensationalizing the visuals in the dark retreat. And I think there still is a little bit, but most people don't like the visuals in the dark. They don't, it tends to be more of a distraction. Like no one who we witness here who really has a deep, intimate experience are like really like the visuals were the best thing. Like some people like them, but they're not like that, the real heart of it. It's really the connection, this like newfound connection with different parts of themselves and different depths of themselves.
Now,
So
when
there
you
are
say visuals, what do you mean by that? So you're in the dark, so people actually have visual experiences while they're there?
some people do. Some people have like where they feel like there's a spotlight shining in their periphery or a spotlight shining on their head, or the dark just goes red or blue, or there's glowing orbs. And they are sensational experiences. There are a lot of people, I'd say the majority of people find them to be distracting and they'd rather them go away. They're just like, it's cool for a few minutes, maybe half an hour, but then they're just like, I was feeling really settled, and it is this stillness that allows me to really drop into deeper levels of subtlety and tenderness within. And this is pulling me out. Few people, but there are some who will have full blown like visuals for a little bit, like like a dream-like phenomena in there. Not
Wow.
many, but it does happen to some. But it lasts, like, the thing is, in the dark that might last 5-10 minutes. It might be the most sensational experience, but then you're back to nothing. And it's unlike in this world, you're going to put it on Instagram and talk about it, and you get to really ride that wave. But in there, there's just no one. And so you could have the most sensational experience and it could last half an hour, but you still have the rest of the day and you're just back to nothing.
Hmm.
And so there is that more like the thing that really has somebody free in the dark is just relaxing
Hmm.
and into the support of the dark, of the floor, of the chair, just that basic simplicity of feeling supported.
Hmm.
And so there are, for some, the visuals. And then when somebody emerges, they're, for those who really dropped into a newfound level of intimacy and connectivity in their body, some people, when they come out, they're like, I can feel what I'm seeing in my body. Like they've so connected in their body, like looking at each different object and taking in the field, they notice the changes and shifts in their body, like on plant medicine that can happen.
Mhm.
And definitely when you first come out, things are moving like an hallucination on like mushrooms or something. Like nothing's really stationary, everything's breathing and moving. That might last 5, 10, 20 minutes for some people. The eyes orient pretty quickly. And yeah, some people, they'll have a heightened sense of smell or a heightened sense of sound. And there is that. It doesn't last that much longer.
Mhm.
And people are like, okay, it's not a peak experience, but it is this kind of bigger arc, full kind of big experience. How does that integrate back into life? How does that actually, what are the benefits? How does it roll over? For a lot of people who, when they drop in, they then know a deeper level of connectivity in their body.
Mhm.
And since they weren't on any kind of substance, there wasn't a teacher that was like, that they were relying on for it. They know that was them. They did that on their own. They connected to new levels of themselves. They saw new things that they can't unsee of what was motivating this behavior. And I was doing this. And what happens in the dark is as they see that, it's like the next moment they're with it.
Mhm.
And unlike being on plant medicine, like where it may be zooming so fast, and then it's like you see and then you integrate and then you integrate because it is really slow. And your next movement is you saw something, and now how do you live the truth of that?
Mhm.
And so in there is when somebody emerges and goes back to their life, it is difficult because they have come to know another part of themselves, and then they're faced with their old self and all the ways that they move. So
Right.
there's initially, for most people, some level of disappointment that they're not living this new truth but as somebody also allows that to really be there, because one of the crux of what somebody comes into in the dark is this quality of inclusion where there's not like, I want to just be this and I'm supposed to be like this, doing this, feeling this. It's like there's this relaxed, settled, connected quality with whatever's there. And so
Mhm.
peace can really carry on where there's not as much of a movement to fix, change, heal, transform, awake, all those things.
Something
There's
be
maybe
different than it is.
more of an emphasis on connecting and being here and
Right.
somebody knowing what that feels like. It's less of a cognitive, performative kind of thing.
Destination. Yeah.
It's a somatic, visceral, felt sense. And that can really carry on where people know what it's like to really feel the feelings. There are a lot of people I'd say more men, but I've definitely heard some women say it, but more men where they're like, you know, I've heard of this thing like feeling, but I had no idea what it meant to feel. Like my wife's talked to me about it or my partner, like I've heard it before, but I actually didn't know what it was like to feel.
Mm.
And like that impact of somebody now knowing what it's like to be connected in their body and to very distinctly know the difference of being oriented in your mind and being oriented in your body. And those are like, and some people are like, God, it's so simple. You just, whatever it is, it's simple. It's not based on a huge experience, but it's fundamental. And so it changes everything because it's like the ground that we move on of like why we move and how we move. And there was some guy who came here, a younger guy, deep in the plant medicine world. And when he came out, he's just, I always thought that like when I'd arrive, I'd be like zapped by an alien and blast off to the galactagon. And just that would be it when I'd arrived. And it was just this tender nurture that brought me home.
Hmm.
And like that really simple thing that it wasn't this special, huge experience. It was something simple. And people are always like, I can't believe how simple it is. And I'm like, but it's so fundamental that it changes everything.
And how many people are able to access that state of being post retreat?
That's a good question. I don't know. We do have every 6 weeks, we have a group Zoom call. Adrian leads the call. It's for all the past dark retreats. And so it really keeps that current alive. I'd say the majority of the people who come are the people who had just been here within the last 6 weeks. And then there are people who have been a year, 2 years, 3 years ago who do come. Most of the people were just here and they're really kind of still processing their experience and then getting together with all these other people who also were in there. And so people do tend to go back to how they were and they still know something more.
Mm-hmm.
And that current still is with them and people will share stories of how they notice that they've changed. And it's not different because it's not like a top down change. Like I'm no longer doing this because I'm not supposed to. It's just, I don't even know what's happened, but this is no longer a thing because that movement in the dark is not like a top down controlling. I'm going to do this and sit this way. It's from the inside out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the change it's more effortless. It's just in that movement to connect and notice,
Mm.
to find safety in your body. And that's one of the questions I'll ask somebody at times when they're in the dark is where someone really attunes to, is there anywhere in my body that I feel safe? What is it like to feel safe in my body? What happens when I feel safe in my body? What desires and impulses arise when I genuinely feel safe in my body? And most people would say, I feel safe. And then you go into the dark and it's an entirely different thing but what really happens when you feel safe and connected in your body and then what happens when you feel stimulated and threatened in your body? And then so these are some really beautiful explorations. It's hard because the mind is a really tricky thing. And I won't go into them now because I know we're getting close on time, but like when we talk about the fear threat response that people experience, there is the unconscious response that people go into: fight, flight, and freeze and fawn in the dark. And it looks different in the dark. Freeze has a different quality of what happens to people while they're in the dark. So does fight and freeze and fawn, or flight and fawn. I'll just talk about flight because that one's freeze can be really fascinating too, of how it appears in the dark. But flight, one of the ways, the most obvious, is people just want to leave. That's really apparent. But the more sneaky way is that people go into their mind and they fantasize and romanticize their life, how amazing their life is. Their work is so beautiful. And even with it being true, and like when I get out, I'm going to do this and I have this idea and it's amazing and they're pumped and it's positive and it's not 5, 10 minutes. It's like a rumination for hours of just when I've gone up multiple times and somebody's a few months ago, somebody's, my life is so beautiful. Like I'm loving being here and my life is beautiful. When I go back, I have this. And that's what they're talking about. I'm able to recognize that is a mechanism of pulling them out of their body because something's happening in the body and this is a safe place to be, which is
Mhm.
totally fine. It's a protective mechanism. It's there for a reason. And maybe there is also the capacity to meet what's happening in the body. And so for this particular person, after she was done sharing, I was like, let's also just tune in with the body. What are you noticing in your body? And within a few seconds, she's just, there's a jitteriness in my chest. And I was like, what happens? Can you just notice where it starts, where it ends? What do the edges feel like? And then she's, my whole body shaking. All of a sudden, this really positive, excited, life's amazing. Right underneath that is, I'm scared and uncomfortable.
Oh,
And she's
wow.
not aware of that at all. And that's very common. It looks different in all the different people. And then as we still, well, is there somewhere where you feel safe in your body, where your feet meet the floor, where your butt meets the floor? What does it feel like to make contact with the floor? What would it feel like to just feel the support of the floor? And then just, oh, I feel safe here. And then it's okay, now what does it feel like in the chest? Once you establish safety in the body, now exploring the areas that were unsafe. And then there's this, then she's, whoa, I feel relaxed. And now that pressure, jitteriness in my chest has subsided. And now I just feel relaxed. And then it's like, whoa, that whole movement of hours of the fantasizing was an escape from something uncomfortable and not being able to. And so that's happening a lot. Now, some people are able to self-regulate. It's more rare where somebody comes and they're able to notice it and they self-regulate on their own. There's varying degrees of support people need, some people weaving in and out of the dark. And again, none of that matters. It's more about just honoring where that movement, authentic movement is of connecting in the body and genuinely feeling safe
Mhm.
and genuinely feeling unsafe. And what's that? And really weaving those two
Wow.
between.
And is it fairly common that most people that come do find that still safe place? Or do you find there are people that come and they just don't really land?
I'd say most people find it at the least when we co-regulate, when we have the check-ins. Most people. There may be some people, they tend to fit in the more spiritual category. I would have definitely fallen into this category in my earlier dark retreats where there's so many layers of protection and the spirituality's made it so complex that they're just like that letting that go would feel so threatening.
Mm.
And so again, that's a smaller percentage, but if we look at the whole span of it, there is that much smaller, but I'd say the majority, most people at least co-regulate during the check-ins so they know what that's like.
Mhm.
And then there's a percentage of people who then 5, 10, 20 minutes, an hour after that check-in, they may go back into their dysregulated state. That may span from just being highly anxious or just ruminating or fantasizing about how lovely their life is. And that may not be obviously that agitating to them. So that spectrum. And then the people who carry that regulation and then genuinely relax and open and they're carried that on their own. And it's a spectrum and it's different for everyone and not like that there's any special mark that someone achieves. It's more the like, what would be most important is just that noticing of, whoa, now I'm starting to feel dysregulated and this is what it feels like. And that's just where I'm at, as opposed to I need to feel like this, because then that is another movement of I don't like how I'm feeling, which is fine. And then to notice that, and that's where it's what happens if you come out, what happens if you turn the light on, what happens if you go see the stars or go lay on the ground, whatever that is that has somebody being able to genuinely be connected in their body. And
Mm.
so I'd say it's a spectrum of, I'd say almost everyone touches that regulated state of just genuinely feeling connected and relaxed.
Mhm.
And then there's a spectrum of how often they return to it and reside there.
Right.
And maybe, and for someone else, it may be way more transformative for this particular person to just begin to notice that they're dysregulated. So this spectrum of it's not, whoa, I just want to be regulated the whole time and open and expansive, but it's unique for each person. This one person, the most transformative thing for them may be just noticing that they're dysregulated. And
Mhm.
maybe they only regulate during the check-ins, but they notice how dysregulated they are and they've never noticed that before.
Mhm.
That could be so transformative. So it's not necessarily about having a certain kind of experience.
Right.
There's one woman who came a few weeks ago and she was numb, which is there's a percentage of people who come here who are numb. I historically would have fit in that category too, not even knowing that they still experience emotion, but they don't have much of a felt sense connectivity in their body. And when those people go in the dark, they go into some form of freeze. So they're pretty relaxed. They're pretty comfortable. They don't experience panic because there's not much sensation. They experience boredom because it's just like dull and numb. And there's really not much going on. Most of them don't realize that they're numb. And there's one woman, she started to notice that. And just that, even though she didn't have whatever and she did, but just that was life changing where she's, whoa, I was never aware. I see that I do this and this because I'm actually dysregulated under the numbness, but I wasn't aware that I wasn't feeling. And just that spectrum that there's not necessarily one particular experience that's
Yeah.
more transformative than another.
So the people are their own medicine, essentially. They go in and darkness gives them a space to witness themselves,
Yeah,
essentially.
totally. Where everything gets pulled away and just then what people are able to see
Wow.
while they're in that.
That's so cool. So you guys have a significant wait list, which is amazing. And you're currently building another dark retreat cave. Yes, is that correct? Or one maybe?
Yes. So we have on the neighboring land here that we haven't started building. We hope to start building this spring, but we've hoped to start building for a bit, so we'll see now.
Mhm.
But there's a movement to build, to add in some more caves, to expand the team,
Mhm.
both to meet more of the demand and just be able to have more people here, but almost more importantly is to continue evolving and refining the offering.
Mhm.
Like there's more that we would add in, there's more kind of like we would have we'd customize more of this weaving in and out of the dark. I mean, for even people who come here who spend the 3, 4 days in the dark, some of them would have a more deeply enriching, nurturing, connective experience if they wove in and out of the dark. Even though they
Right.
made it 3, 4 days and they had a really powerful experience, but there's so much more that was undigested. It's so exposing that you don't want to go beyond what you're not able to actually be with. And each person's unique. And it's not a matter of I want to and I can. It's so much more beyond will of being with it. And
I think the will is another mechanism that we begin to
definitely,
witness in those situations, right? Where it's
for
like,
sure.
it's not, it's dialing into an outcome. And that in itself is suffering. I think that's where we see the most suffering is when we have an expectation of what
Totally.
will be, and then it doesn't align to that. And we're like, what was that for? And we miss the whole point.
Totally. Yeah. So part of it is, yeah, the evolution and the evolving and the refining of the offering. There's a lot of other elements that we'd bring in. There's other kind of more curated weaving in and out of the dark. So the expansion will also help us really evolve, refine the offering, and be able to have more people come and shorten that wait list.
Neat. If you had a window into the next 5 to 10 years for SkyCave, what would it look like?
I have a hard time as I just wrap my head around the expansion. 5 or 10 years, I'm not sure. I could say that if and when we build the expanded center, I could see that as we further refine the model of being with people in the dark and bring in other people to work with us and learn from and collaborate on What's it like to be with this type of people, these type of people in this structure when that's in the dark? I could see dark retreats becoming more popular.
Mhm.
And certainly my hope is that um, it grows in a way where there's proper qualified support, because
Mhm.
I do think it can be dangerous because darkness is initially a stressor, and like it takes, I think, having a somatic therapist or somebody who's in internal family systems with a heavy like somatic base
Right.
is really important. Somebody who's tracking the nervous system and it isn't more of this spiritual orientation that may create more dissociation. And so us with others evolving the model and then just seeing how it grows, how it, I think it can be, it's been amazing witnessing people with different kind of traumas. Somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome came here, and just how the benefits of it, and seeing that evolve as the model evolves, and then it works and interfaces with different structures and conditions, people with different ways of being, of how that benefits them. And so seeing this as perhaps an emerging modality that,
Yeah, big time. Big time.
yeah,
That begs another question for me is, do you have people that come in with illnesses that obviously is there people that you would red flag and be like, I'm not sure that this is the right type of experience for you? Maybe people who are dealing with psychosis or schizophrenia or depression, anxiety. Would there be any markers for applicants that you'd be like, I don't think this is the right experience for you?
definitely somebody with psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, things like that, because the darkness can definitely accentuate that. There's definitely neurochemical changes that happen. I think people in the maybe more sensationalized aspect of dark retreat, there's like the DMT comes in and you're going to see all this. And I just don't know the truth of that. And witnessing hundreds of people come through here, like, yes, there are neurochemical changes that happen. There are significant things that happen on certain days, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to visions or what somebody would maybe see as a DMT experience. For some people, that may happen, and many others not. But
Mhm.
there are definitely neurochemical changes that happen.
Mhm.
And so that may be really disorienting for somebody who is psychologically unstable. So
Right.
that would, and it's just different. Like, some people who maybe have social anxiety, we notice sometimes they do really well in the dark because the social aspect's gone. And they're
Mhm.
like, whoa, I'm not actually an anxious person. I just have some kind of condition that happens when I'm in a social setting that makes me feel anxious. And now all of a sudden they're like, I'm actually a really relaxed person. And then there's more access to that. And so that may change the interface, the threat that they feel when they're in social
Right.
settings. So it matters what induces the anxiety. So there's constantly it's, oh, for this it may not be good, but then somebody comes and they have that same thing and they have an amazing experience, and oh, what was the nuance there? Because there's so many different things that create somebody's structure or conditioning. So it's hard, definitely like psychologically unstable. And I think when it's structured in a way where there is the ability to weave in and out of the dark, and there is some like somatic support that's there, that it makes the availability for the a dynamic audience. And if it
Underwrite the situation and adapt it to that individual.
totally, yeah, we've had some people with type 1 diabetes come through, which, and that's something that we've been working with, evolving of in those. There was a guy who came, I don't know if it was type 1 or type 2. He had diabetes, and he had talked with his doctor and he was like, I'm fine with my levels. I know how to monitor them in the dark. But after that first day, when I went up to check on him, he was uneasy. And in a lot of circumstances, I'd be with somebody and we'd co-regulate and then they'd go bed. I was just like, hey, you know what? I feel like you could turn on the light and check your levels. And I was like, it won't take away from the dark. Like, if anything, it's going to add to it because you're going to feel safer. And if you feel safer, you're going to go deeper naturally.
Yeah.
Like, the safer you feel, the more natural. And then as you access, just like that Nisargadatta, like instead of seeking for what you don't have, uncover what it is that you've never lost. If you're just safe and natural, that thing will blossom on its own. And
Mm.
when I came up in the evening, he was like, Scott, I'm so happy. I feel so safe in here and relaxed. I turned the light on twice for 30 seconds, checked my levels. And then he would even at other times, like turn on the light. It wasn't even about checking his levels, just to orient and have his body know I'm safe. I can turn on the light. I'm not stuck in here. I want to be here. And he was like, I feel so safe. And turning on the light a few times a day for 20, 30 seconds is like actually helping me go deeper.
Right.
And like for somebody to lean in that way is, yeah, really amazing. So the whole, it's been an exploration of, I definitely think people who are psychologically unstable, not really a good fit for going into the dark. Maybe in an expanded model, going in for an hour and then
Right.
having support and then like really dripping in the darkness with a lot of support and using the darkness as a vehicle of exposure. It becomes a soothing kind of space, but that takes, it's not initially
Right.
soothing. Yeah.
Right.
Initially, for some, maybe because there's a melatonin dump and you sleep a lot. But
Mhm.
once you've done that phase, then it's a little bit of a stressor
Right.
until we're actually able to be honest with what's really present.
So everybody gets to have a sense of time when they're in there? Or is that one of the things that creates stress and a fear response? Because I initially thought, is that do you know, do you have a certain time frame that you're like, we're going to be here to check in at this time? And then because it would be, I would think you would initially sleep a lot and then you might lose track of time. And then is that something that you play around with or
Yeah, you definitely lose track of time. There's check-ins morning and evening. So you have like,
markers?
yeah, I'm up within a range of 2.5 hours. I'm up in the same time in the morning and the same time in the evening.
Mhm.
And just the different types of structures. Some people want to ask what time it is, but they feel ashamed that they're going to ask what time it is. Other people don't care. They're just like, tell me what time it is. And so it's just, and then some people are uneasy. They want to ask, but they don't want to know because and so we really, that's where we try to strip as much shame away. And it's just like you letting nurture lead. Whatever feels most nurturing to you is going to have you actually feeling more connected.
Interesting. Because my perception of that, it was like, okay, we're going to do this hard thing. We're going to go and
Right.
meet the resistance. And I'm so
Sure.
glad that we got a chance to talk so in depth because it sounds so different. So that's not the point. It's not about meeting your resistance. It's not about seeing your edge.
Uh-huh.
It's about safety. It's about really being able to drop into I am completely at home in my body no matter what emotions, what energies, what comes up, and I'm safe to step into what feels right.
Or I'm not. And I'm not at home in my body,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
most people initially see, which is I'm not at home in my body. I'm not okay with these emotions. And when you let nurture lead, and there's going to be, as opposed to I have to stay in here and then it's like time to cope. But if there's no movement towards nurture, then there's not going to be a natural movement to feeling at home. There's going to be this kind of hovering above. And so, yeah, there is that. It is difficult. It is challenging. You come up against your resistance, and there's enough of that. Let's
Yeah.
let nature lead. And if that means turning on the light, coming out, we have a foam roller in there. There's like a little ball. There's a zero gravity chair, a weighted blanket, a hot bath. There's as much comfortable, nurtureful things that we could bring into the dark that
Mm.
has somebody leaning into that nurture so that they can begin to become aware of what's happening in their body.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. It sounds amazing. I had a different perception in some ways about what this experience was going to be like. And now I'm just like, wow, I was called to this and I've been called to it for a really long time. And now I'm just totally grounded in that I'm being called for a reason. It sounds like a really incredible experience.
Yeah. Awesome. I look forward to being here with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that very much. So, in wrapping up, I have one last question for you. If you had one piece of advice for our listeners to pursuing their path of fulfillment or purpose, or what tools have you used to follow that inner peace that you are teaching and have discovered in the darkness?
Yeah. One of the Suzuki Roshi, who brought Zen Buddhism to the West, one of the things he used to say was the most important thing is remembering the most important thing. And so, what is that? Like, not to digress too much, but there's somebody in the dark now, and we were up talking, and he was we were just relaxing together. And it was just back to the simplicity of what does the chair feel like on your back? What does it feel like to feel supported by the chair? And all of a sudden he's, whoa, I feel really relaxed and I'm just here. And my shoulders dropped and my jaw dropped and I'm really just content. And then he was just like, but will this help me achieve samadhi and bhanga? And it's just, I was like, is that really important to you? What matters most to you? And he's just being at peace. And this was like that refinement of getting really clear. The darkness really helps you reprioritize, just like being lost 5 days in the desert would. What
Right.
matters most? And when you're really clear on what matters most, it's just if that was leading, what would be happening in you? What would be the impulse? If it's really peace that matters most, then what does that look like? And then just the basics of, well, then what does it feel like to relax and feel supported by the floor? Or being honest that peace doesn't matter at all. There was a woman who came here, and while she was in the dark, and it was like, what matters most? And she was like achieving spirituality and all these things. And then afterwards, she's, you know what? I really just want to be rich and famous. And I was like, that's great. Now you know what matters most, and you just go out and do whatever it is to get you rich and famous.
Mhm.
Next question would have been like, well, I did ask, like, why? Like, why do you want to be rich and famous? She's so people notice me. And so I'm seen. And so ultimately, so there's a sense of connection. And
Mhm.
so if one can really distill down what matters most, and then when you have that thing that matters most, what's happening in you? And ultimately, that is what matters most. You
Mhm.
want that feeling. And that feeling's not created. There are things that prompt that feeling.
Right.
Obviously, that's different for everyone. So there's no universal thing that prompts a feeling of love.
Mhm.
And so it's that felt sense that matters most. And so, what is it like to really begin to connect with that felt sense? It lives in us. So it's not when it's going to really arise when we feel
Right.
relaxed and connected, and but letting it be someone's own unique direct way of touching that, because it's important that it's their own and it's not somebody else's idea. So it's, what do you want? And when you had that thing, what does it give you? What's happening in you? And then what's it like just to rest with that felt sense of what
Mhm.
you really want? And then ultimately that felt sense can be there along with pain and sadness and anguish and shame. Like then all of a sudden multiple things can exist at the same time. So yeah, that kind of distilling down of what matters most. And then, like Suzuki Roshi says, the most important thing is remembering the most important thing.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Thank you. It has been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I am very much looking forward to my experience. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your time on your retreat center, and we can't wait to hear what's to come next.
Awesome. Thanks for this time, Stephanie. I appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Take care,
Yeah.
Sean.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.